Brilliant. Heloisa, are you okay to share your screen and provide your presentation?
Yes, thank you. I will share now.
Yeah.
Please let me know if you can see.
Yep, I can see that.
Yeah, can you hear me well as well?
Yep.
Okay. So
Okay,
I'm
I'm
gonna
just
start.
going to disappear off the screen for a wee bit just to let Heloisa do their talk. Thank you
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you. Good afternoon. My name is Heloisa Dickinson. I'm a postgraduate researcher working here at the University of Glasgow. I work in a project called GALANT. So it's an acronym that means Glasgow as a Living Lab Accelerator. It's a project that proposes solutions to transform Glasgow in a more resilient city against the effects of climate change. We have 8 working groups. We have 5 working packages and 3 work streams. I work in WP3, which is working package 3, regenerating vacant and derelict land. I started my PhD in October 2022, so I just started the 3rd year this month. And today I'm going to talk about enzyme-mediated multiphase precipitation, which is a technique that I created for water and soil remediation. I would like to start with a question that is why I created EMMP, or enzyme-mediated multiphase precipitation. Exactly 1 year ago, I was in the lab prepared to start my experiments in EICP, which is enzyme-induced carbonate. Yes?
Sorry. Just your slides have disappeared for some reason. I've just noticed if you're able to reshare them again.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry,
Just
I don't know what happened. That's it, better.
Is it back?
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so enzyme-induced carbonate precipitation, which is a classical geotechnical method for soil improvement, and it's also used for immobilization of contaminants. It's based on the hydrolysis of urea by the enzyme urease that breaks urea into ammonium and carbonate ions. The carbonate ions, in the presence of metals, will then precipitate carbonates. So I tested 9 different ecotoxic metals with 3 different concentrations, first in test tubes and then in contaminated soil as well. The experiment went really well. We managed to immobilize more than 50% of the ecotoxic metals with the concentrations that we chose for those experiments. However, there was a big problem, and the big problem was the byproduct, ammonium. In our experiments, we found between 1,000 and 3,500 milligrams per liter of ammonium, and that using a crude urease extract that I'm going to explain later on. Comparing those numbers with the literature, we found that they were compatible. The literature cites numbers between 1,000 to 10,000 milligrams per liter, which is extremely high. We have an image here on the right side that shows the background values for fresh water, potable water, and soil. So for fresh water, we have 1.0 milligrams per liter, potable water 0.5, and soil 1 to 5 milligrams per kilograms, ideally below 2 milligrams per kilograms. Then I did a quick calculation. I used approximately 100 ml of my cementation solution to treat 5 grams of soil. So using that proportion to treat 1 hectare of land, considering only the first 30 centimeters of soil or the top soil, we would produce between 0.84 to 84 tons of ammonium. That's using the minimum and maximum numbers here, which is the equivalent of a small environmental disaster. Then I knew that I wouldn't be able to propose EICP simply. I would have to propose EICP with a method for remediation of the remediation, or I would have to try to find another solution. And I decided to try to create another method of precipitation, precipitating not only calcite, I wanted to use both byproducts of the hydrolysis of urea. I wanted to be able to immobilize or in fact, use the ammonium and use the carbonate ions in the crystalline structure of the newly formed minerals. I researched and I found out that the best candidate for that would be struvite, which is a metal ammonium X aqua, magnesium ammonium X aqua phosphate. And then I decided to try to precipitate calcite and struvite together. And I wanted to do that using only or as maximum as possible waste material. So I decided to use soybeans as source of crude urease because I discovered researching that up to 30% of all soybean produced globally is discarded due to poor quality or mechanical breakage. So we have a lot of discarded soybean. Urea, recomposed from urine, human and animal urine. And as a source of metals, I used bone meal, a solution of bone meal. So theoretically, we could, with the parameters that we use, precipitate all those minerals that are showing here. What's the mechanism behind the MMP? It's very similar to the mechanism behind the ICP. We have urease breaking urea into two components, carbonate ions and ammonium. The carbonate ions will then combine with water. They will form bicarbonate and hydroxide. Then we have here carbonates, bicarbonates in solution, and increase of pH. But if we also have phosphates in the solution, the increase of pH will cause an speciation of the phosphates, and then the phosphates will be able to combine with the metals in the solution, and we will precipitate phosphates as well. So you're precipitating carbonates and phosphates now, and not only carbonates. This is the experimental design that I used for EMMP, which is very similar to the one that I used for EICP because I wanted to be able to compare the results from both techniques. So I use ecotoxic metals in water. There's 9 ecotoxic metals. Here now I included chromium hexavalent in 3 different concentrations. I prepared my crude urease extract myself, my own method. I will explain my own method in the next slides. Urea solution dissolved in the ecotoxic metal solution, and the bone meal solution distributed into 5 replicas, 5 test tubes, and then I left in the oven for approximately 3 to 4 days, removed from the in the incubator at 25 degrees Celsius, and then left for 4 to 7 days curating. Then I filtrated to separate the residual liquid and the precipitate and send the samples for assessment, prepare the samples for assessment. When I was developing the technique and when I was doing my work in the laboratory, I think I created this concept as well, adaptive optimization. I used only local materials and a waste as a resource approach based on the GHG protocol and circular economy guidelines. So in practice, what does that mean? It means that I'm using less consumables, less energy, less time, less chemicals, and producing less carbon emissions, whilst keeping the same efficiency. That translates to lower cost as well, but as just a positive byproduct of this method. I want to explain a bit more the method. For example, to produce crude urease extract using soybeans, we have like classical recipes in online and in the literature. Usually what they tell you to do is to grind the soybeans very fine and then sieve and separate a fraction with the exact granulometry that they say it's the best one. Each method has one, but it's very fine. And then mix the powder with water and acetone or ethanol. Stir with the magnetic stirrer for 30 minutes, put in the refrigerator to decant, and then collect the supernatant, desalt, and then do a centrifugation, and then filter with paper filter, and you have your crude urease extract. What I decided to do with the adaptive optimization was to leave the soybean soaking overnight at room temperature, then just use a juicer to extract the first solution, then desalt straight away, leave it decanting at room temperature, collect the supernatant, and centrifuge. Instead of centrifuging for 30 minutes, centrifuging just for 10 minutes, and then filtering and collecting the crude urease extract. So when then measuring the enzyme activity in the two solutions, my method, the solution that I created with my method was just like between 5 and 8%. We had less activity, enzymatic activity, which is pretty good considering all the steps that we skipped and all the savings. So this is an example of adaptive optimization. So just to start showing the results now, this is a graph showing the mass of the precipitates per element and some of the morphology of the precipitates as well. So you can see that we precipitated more cobalt, nickel, chromium, and lead, and less of the other elements compared to the control. And here I put this image because this is what we see right when we remove the precipitate from the oven, because we filter the precipitate, we separate the residual liquid and the precipitates, then the precipitates we put in the oven to dry to analyze. So this is cobalt, the solution with cobalt, T3, the most concentrated one. When I saw these crystals for the first time, the colors, I knew straight away that we were having cationic substitution of cobalt by magnesium because of the colors that we got here. And I knew that we were also precipitating struvite because they had the characteristic habit morphology of the crystals here. So we were precipitating struvite and calcite as well. So these are some images from scanning electron microscope of the carbonate phase. So this is all calcite with different levels of ecotoxic metals and different ecotoxic metals inside the crystal structure as well. I'm doing an analysis of the sizes, the granulometric composition, and also the morphological differences between elements and between concentrations. So there are some morphologies that we see in all of the elements, like sphere, dumbbell, and star, and others that are we can find only for certain elements or for certain concentrations. These are images for the struvite phase. For most of the time, we will find the struvite with the characteristic habit, which is coffin-like shape here that we see. Sometimes we can get some butterfly crystals or more elongated prisms as well. One interesting characteristic of the struvite that we are precipitating is that the crystals seem to be hollow. I couldn't find the significance for this characteristic, but I'm researching. Here is XRD powder, showing again that the main phases that we have for all elements in different proportions is calcite and struvite. This is the efficiency for 6 elements. So you can see that is 100% almost for lead, very high for cadmium, chromium, and for cobalt as well, and slightly lower for lithium and nickel, but overall very good. This is the percentage of decrease in ammonium production, but here I'm comparing to minimum and maximum found in the literature, 1,000 and 10,000, and the maximum that I got in my ESCP experiment, which is 3,500. So worst case scenario, we are decreasing the ammonium production in 50%, and best case, we are reducing over 90%. This is some EDS mapping is a technique to check the composition of the crystal, the chemical composition of the crystal in points. So this is a study that I'm doing now. It is the variation of the composition from core to ring and the layer structure of certain minerals, like the internal morphology, because this is linked to the dissolution rates that you will see. So this is a cobalt calcite, and we can see that the variation here from core to rim is from 229 to 1071. This is a chromium struvite, and we can see that we have here in a more central part 10-11%, and here we go to 28.71% of chromium in percentage inside the crystal structure of this crystal, which is very, very high. This is a cobalt struvite. We have a variation between 2.69 to 5, up to 12%. I put some elemental mapping here just to show some features. For example, calcium, probably we have this texture because probably we have intergrowth of small calcite crystals with the struvite. And one interesting thing that we see here, like cobalt, the lighter areas, they show areas with higher concentration. So the cobalt has higher concentration close to the rim. Magnesium, on the contrary, in the core. And this is because cobalt is substituting magnesium in the site X of the general formula of the struvite. So we have the cationic substitution. This is data, a crystal that I create, a crystal structure with the data that we got from XRD single crystal. This is the simplified data here. And here we can see we can see the cobalt in purple substituting the magnesium that is orange here. So it's an isomorphous replacement in the octahedral site of the crystal. So some positive aspects so far that we got from this technique. It seems to be highly efficient to immobilize lead, cadmium, chromium, lithium, nickel, decreases ammonia production from 50 to 97.5%, depending on the standard that you're using for comparison. Can be used in a range of granulometry of materials. I tested in 4 different types of soils, 2 clay soils and 2 sandy soils from Glasgow, contaminated. And we went up to 4 cycles very easily. So it can be applied to very fine grain soils. There is a flexibility in carbonation and phosphatization as can be used in several cycles. And also to decrease, if in just one cycle we are getting too much carbonation or phosphatization, we can decrease the concentration of the solutions that we use to prepare the cementation solution, and we can decrease the enzymatic activity as well. Some challenges that we found so far. The decrease in ammonia production is not optimal because we would like to have it above 90% for all scenarios. We still have a bit of heterogeneity in the soil when it comes to the levels of carbonation and phosphatization up to 30 centimeters depth. There is a variation in the immobilization of the ECOTOXIC metals inside the crystal structure per phase and per element, as I showed in the images. And we still need to assess other possible byproducts like chlorine, sulfate, and phosphate, and also metals in the residual liquid. I'm working with other techniques as well, in a combination of techniques. So I'm working with accelerated carbonation with waste concrete to compare with accelerated carbonation using olivine gather. Accelerated carbonation would be mixing soil, in this case, mixing soil with materials, putting in an incubator and applying 10% and 20% CO2 concentration. I'm also comparing MMP and ERCP for organic contaminants, phenanthrene, benzene, and pyrene at the moment. We want to extend that. And also I'm testing the efficiency using different biomaterials as source of urease. So I'm using soybeans, and in one of the experiments I use spent coffee ground. I'm only testing waste. So the results with spent coffee grounds are really good. We were not expecting that. And I also tested banana peel and potato peel, but the solution didn't produce enzymatic activity that was good enough. We managed to precipitate calcite, but not good enough to be used at the moment with the method that we created. We need to change the method. Some combined methods like EMMP and EICP in soil plus forced carbonation. So using the cementation solution and then putting in the incubator and applying 10%, 20% CO2. EMMP in soil plus waste concrete plus forced carbonation. And I'm going to start next year with one of my supervisors an experiment with enhanced rock weathering using waste concrete and using enzyme solutions derived from waste as well. If you want to contact me via email, this is my email, or you can also find me easily just putting my name on Google and Gallant or PhD Gallant. And I finish here. And I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to show my work. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I'll have a couple of questions possibly for you then, and hopefully some other people will too. But I think we'll move on to Nick now, if that's okay. And I'll let Nick. Heloisa, if you're able, Heloisa, sorry, if you're able to stay on until the end, just for the questions, that'd be really appreciated. But
of course, yes.
Yeah, cool, right. And so Nick from WSP is going to be chatting about bowling, which is always an interesting sight for everyone here, I think. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say, Nick, and I will turn my camera off and let you get on with it. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. As Stevie said, I'm Nick Townsend of WSP. This presentation is based on what was a joint submission by ourselves, WDC, DME and ESSO to this year's Brownfield Briefing Awards, and that was in the Best Preparatory Work category. I've also added a subtitle, A Platform Successful Remediation, which I trust becomes apparent throughout this discussion. Just noting I'm a stand-in for Sarah Hamill of WDC. She's rumoured to be enjoying herself in New York, so can't be here. So what makes best preparatory works? Well, I think we can probably agree a suitably scoped ground investigation or phases of, monitoring of groundwater, surface water and ground gas, preparation of a conceptual site model, completion of a DQRA, and ideally some modelling. What about stakeholders being involved from project inception so they become active participants, are engaged in project progress, rather than just being passive recipients of information? What about holding routine meetings to allow regulators to raise their concerns, solutions to be presented, and agreement reached? So what about effective change management, avoiding protracted correspondence and document revisions? What about early contractor involvement? So getting a contractor involved at a very early stage of works to bring their knowledge and experience to the table. And also always consider the end. What does validation reporting need to look like? How are we going to get project sign-off? So in this discussion, I hope to demonstrate that extending the scope of preparatory work to include these elements helps ensure successful project delivery. So a little bit of background. I believe Sarah's previously presented on this project. If you don't know where Bowling is, it's about 30 minutes drive to the northwest from Glasgow city centre. The site itself is located to the west of Bowling Village, Unfortunately for me, I'm based in South Wales, so it's at least 7 hours from my home, or 13.5 hours on a bad train day. I've been project manager since late 2017, and I became full-time dedicated to the project from May 2021, when the remediation contractor mobilised the site. Some 18 months ago, I then became project director when my then colleague retired. And I'd also like to add, because she's on this call, that I've been brilliantly supported by Hazel Dinsdale as environmental consultant. She's been full-time on site since May 2021, up until pretty much last week. And also prior to this, she undertook multiple ground investigations and monitoring campaigns, along with a whole range of other site work, always humorously responding to my distant request of, "Are you finished yet?" with some good old Glaswegian humour. So the site itself was first developed in the early 1900s, initially operated by a British Mexican. It became part of ESSO in, I think, 1939. The site progressively expanded via reclamation of the mudflats using dredged materials from the Clyde and reached a peak size of about 41 hectares. It was utilised for the bulk storage and distribution of oils via both road and rail. It closed in the 1990s and was then progressively demolished, decommissioned. The Eastfield area of the site was remediated in 2012-2014 via ex situ bioremediation. Obviously, this presentation refers to the remaining 35 hectares. We also had the Henry Bell Monument. And if you're interested in Henry Bell, he apparently designed the first paddle steamer. And there's also Dunglass House and Dunglass Castle that are both listed buildings. So during this talk, I'll reference areas of the site. Cunningly, Eastfield is in the east, and Westfield is in the west. We also have Northfield in the north. So this shows the site around 1927. This is the Centrefield area, showing bulk storage tanks. Eastfield is the area to the top right-hand corner of the screen. This is another image, I think also from 1927. And this illustrates further expansion of the site through further reclamation from mudflats. It's understood that dredge materials from the Clyde were pumped in and progressively displaced the river water. This is an aerial photograph from, I think, June 1975, and it shows the site at its sort of peak size and capacity. This is it in around 2005, showing the site post-decommissioning, so you can see all the structures have gone. So post-closure, there have been multiple phases of GI by many different consultancies with over 1,200 exploratory locations with different objectives, with each GI having sort of different objectives and standards. What was found was significant hydrocarbon impact, perhaps unsurprisingly to both soil and groundwater. There was asbestos impact, and it was likely that this impact is from buildings that were demolished and just crushed up and left there. We also have the other challenge of the site being adjacent to SSSI and Ramsar designated areas. And we have redshanks overwinter in the Clyde estuary. They use the mudflats for feeding, and the works are obliged to minimise any disturbance to them. So, like a good consultant contractor, we undertook the traditional elements, DQRA, remediation options appraisal, prepared a remediation strategy, submitted the planning application, produced a scope of works for the remediation contractor to cost and work against, and acted as environmental consultant during the remediation works. But going back a stage, very early on, the client project team recognised the value of early engagement. So we undertook a presentation to SEPA, WDC planners, and the contaminated land officer. And during that, we set out sort of high-level aims and key project deliverables as we started that long journey to agreeing the remediation strategy. I think the early involvement enabled sort of face-to-face introductions and also allowed the regulators to set out their concerns and expectations. The primary concern was the presence of hydrocarbon impact within unsaturated and smear zones, and the DQRA clearly noted a risk to the water environment. The regular meetings established a forum for discussion, but also afforded the regulators the opportunity to directly question and challenge, with various degrees of robust debate ensuing. The forum also permitted a consensus to be reached on the remediation criteria, but not necessarily in one single meeting. So hydrocarbon impact was clearly the main driver, but risk to human health was also considered, with more onerous criteria being adopted for the upper 600 millimeters. The remediation criteria themselves were based on a commercial without buildings end use, and this was because the redevelopment design was not defined or known at the time and would require further raising of site levels to mitigate flood risk. The 9,600 milligrams per kilogram excavation criteria was agreed as a pragmatic target to be protective of risk to surface water and dissolved phase and mobile LNAPL. Based on the ROA at the time, thermal treatment was considered the most suited technology, and a treatment target of 4,000 milligrams per kilogram TPH was agreed. In addition, there was a visual assessment for stockpiled soils, which, whilst they may meet chemical criteria, but illustrated evidence of oils. So the identified areas were subject to bulk excavation to define depths. Materials were to be stockpiled on a dedicated platform and sentenced through both field assessment and lab testing for reuse without any treatment, if they needed treatment, or if they were unsuitable to remain on off-site disposal. And at the time, it's envisaged 50,000 cube of soils would require treatment, with LNAPL being recovered from the open excavations. So this illustrates the extent of the identified areas. As I said, excavations were to be extended to define depths, excavations to be validated to demonstrate compliance with site criteria. The excavated materials were taken to the platform, stockpiled in 100-meter cube piles and tested again to determine suitability for reuse, requirement for treatment, or off-site disposal. The keenly interested amongst you will notice the straight lines, and I'd just like to reassure you that contamination is no respecter of straight lines. So the meetings with the regulators were maintained through to final agreement in December 2018 when we received planning. But an issue that SEPA had raised was their concern that whilst an excavation could meet the excavation criteria, residual impact could extend beyond the excavation extents and not be picked up in that sampling. So it's agreed to install further verification boreholes that were installed 6 meters from the excavation base and at 40-meter linear intervals. Each of those locations was subject to soil sampling and chemical analysis, with subsequent monitoring for LNAPL. If a borehole failed excavation criteria or LNAPL was identified, that excavation would then be subsequently extended. So again, the value of the routine meetings was to provide a forum for raising concerns, proposing change. It enabled solutions to be tabled and debated to achieve an outcome that was agreeable to all, effectively streamlining change management processes, and for me, avoiding protracted document revisions was key because I was doing them. And another key element was that all those meetings that we had progressively built trust between all parties. In the interim period prior to remediation, contact was maintained throughout regular project updates to the regulators, and then liaison sort of kicked off during the execution phase, or possibly before that when the contractor was initially appointed. And I think a real benefit from the project was the continuity of involvement of both Sarah and Murray as regulators. This is a quote provided by Murray for the submission. I won't read it all to you, but basically it acknowledged the early involvement in open discussions, which permitted them to have the opportunity to influence preparatory works and agree procedures for verification and validation. Just to show you a bit about the site, this is during the initial commissioning phase. This is set up the soil treatment plant and associated water equipment. This is a view from the west on one of those rare, fine sunny days in Bowling. This is a midwinter view. This one actually shows installation of new rock armour along the centrefield frontage. A very challenging excavation in the southeast corner due to numerous piles in close proximity. This was an area that was extended in Westfield B, had to be undertaken using sheet piling due to the depth. And you can see by the standing water that presented quite a challenge during the works. So DME were retained under an ECI. That enabled the early onboarding of the remediation contractor onto the project team. This allowed them to fully appreciate client objectives, including project delivery and SO's onerous health and safety requirements. Also allowed them to become familiar with both the remediation strategy and scope of works, and it afforded the opportunity to identify risk items and to propose value engineering, and finally to engage with regulators at an early stage to propose and agree change. And whilst not wanting to put words into her mouth, but I'll take the opportunity as she's not here, Sarah often mentioned the frustration of agreeing a remediation strategy, only to find out at verification stage the contractor did something different. So I think the ECI really avoided this issue. An example of the change proposed was the visual assessment criteria. Our Belgian colleagues have a very binary approach. They like definitive answers such as yes or no, and they accordingly raised concern over the subjectivity of any visual assessment, viewing that one person's clean is another's dirty. So they proposed a bespoke field test to assess LNAPL mobility within soils. This is a crude illustration of the process, but it involved the mixing of 1 kilogram of soil with a litre of water, and following a period of agitation, subsequent centrifuging to separate LNAPL to permit its measurement within a test tube. And the regulators were very receptive to this proposal, and to verify this, DME undertook site trials and were able to demonstrate its reliability and replicability. And it was agreed that a test tube thickness of 1 millimetre was deemed to represent a fail. So this sets out the process. So it was agreed that where stockpiles recorded a concentration of less than 9,600, but greater than 5,000, these would be subject to the LNAPL test. So if they were less than 5,000, they were suitable to code backfill. If they were greater than 5,000 but less than 9.6, they had the NAPL mobility test, which the Belgians liked because it had a pass or fail result. But really this quantitative assessment eliminated any subjective observation, and by testing all stockpiles with concentrations greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram of TPH, represents a really robust approach to the risk of potential LNAPL generation from soils which otherwise pass the excavation criteria. The tests also allayed concerns over a non-visible impact. During historical operations, the site was also known to have stored white oils, and where soils were found to be impacted with white oil, the often characteristic black hydrocarbon staining was absent. So as you can see, not all visually unimpacted soils are clean. Returning to the benefit the discussion forum, during remediation works, DME later sought to introduce a rapid LNAPL test to minimize delay when undertaking deep excavations. In summary, this test replaced the 4 minutes of agitation with some handshaking, and this was presented in a monthly meeting to the regulators, and DME provided supporting data for both tests. This was accepted by the regulator on the basis that further duplicate testing was undertaken and consistency could be demonstrated. So this process allowed the regulators to be involved in change requests, with proposed change explained and discussed, and typically prompt agreement was reached. Furthermore, this avoided the need to engage in extensive correspondence or subsequent unpicking of various verification reports to identify digression from what was agreed in the remediation strategy. During the ECI phase, DME also challenged the use of thermal treatment, and they proposed soil washing based on their experience as an alternative strategy. Their experience suggested soil washing had a far lower energy input than thermal treatment, based on a fuel equivalent of 4 to 10 litres per tonne for soil washed treated materials to 60 to 110 litres per tonne for thermal. To validate the suitability of soil washing, DME undertook additional site investigation to support existing information, but also to gain more information, which enabled them to verify the proportion of granular and cohesive materials. This identified a 60-40 split between granular and cohesive materials, with TPH impact predominantly associated with those granular soils, which contained less than 25% fines. DME concluded that the impacted materials were suited to soil washing, and whilst filter cake requires off-site disposal, so it has some other impact, they were able to demonstrate significant benefits which outweighed those disadvantages. A little note that I think with the subsequent hike prices of gas, the client was very pleased to have not gone down the thermal route. And anyway, following presentations to the project team on the proposed change and subsequently to the regulators, an in-principle agreement was reached, and also a reduced target based on the ability of soil washing to reduce hydrocarbon impact was adopted, and that was 3,000 milligrams per kilogram rather than the 4,000 target previously agreed. So this revision was submitted within a bridging document, and once agreed, a revised strategy was issued and formally accepted by the regulators. So this whole process allowed discussion and almost prompt, rapid conclusion. So I think another important aspect preparation is how do you get to the end? So following contractor appointment in March 2020, regulatory meetings have been maintained, initially on alternate months, but became monthly with commencement of remediation works. Throughout, regulators have been able to stay appraised of project progress, with site challenges and proposed variations to the strategy openly discussed. Through post-site meeting walkovers, they may be able to view issues at first hand and witness progression. In addition, there's been an open house invite such that regulators could visit the site at any time. The monthly meetings also permitted discussion on the format and contents of the verification report, with a focus on avoiding duplication, and with over 5,000 soil samples collected and 20,000 on-site tests undertaken, the need for clear presentation of data. So following an early agreement on the format and provision of data, draft reports have been submitted as areas complete. We received comments, and then DME have adapted those comments and revised reports made. So the intention has been to provide succinct documents with a consistent format that ultimately minimises review time by the regulators. So with the works now complete and the project in the verification phase, the benefits of an agreed reporting format allied to involved regulators who've witnessed project progression hopefully facilitates prompt review and project sign-off. So to conclude with regards to the ECI, it had real benefits by allowing the contractor to become familiar with the site and project objectives, along with the expectations of both the client and regulators. It afforded them the opportunity to close out or reduce risk, to propose and agree value engineering, to demonstrate reliability of on-site testing, and also to propose and agree change to scope and strategy. I think the regulatory engagement was founded on collaboration with trust built through openness and honesty. The meetings permitted open debate and robust discussion. I think we've been privileged to have active and engaged regulators who could question and respond to questions promptly. And as previously, the open door allowed the regulators to witness the project from start to the finish. I'm aware of a key frustration that's been voiced by Sarah, not on this project, but regarding others, is the lack of project visibility between agreement of the remediation strategy and receipt of the verification report, which often involve completely different parties. So Sarah kindly provided a quote, which I'll let you read. I think we had a fundamentally excellent relationship with all regulators, and I hope that I've demonstrated the value of broadening the scope of preparatory works and acknowledge that whilst a robust GI, considered conceptual site model and effective DQRA modelling, etc., are all required elements, the benefits of early involvement of both contractor and regulator and the continued active participation of engaged regulators has allowed the team to successfully navigate many of the challenges and pitfalls that typically complex large-scale projects such as this encounter. So some of you may already know the answer, but did the judges agree with me? Well, almost. We got a highly commended. The winners were actually ACOM and Clyde Gateway for Shorefield. That was the evolution of a conceptual site model and remediation strategy. So congratulations to them and apologies for the poor quality of the photo. So on that, I'll conclude and ask if there are any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. That was really, really interesting. I noticed that you even asked everyone if they've got any questions, and at the moment it's a wee bit quiet. I did have one wee question for you, Nick, in regards to, was there ever any discussion, like you're saying thermal treatment wouldn't have been suitable, like it just was completely inefficient in comparison to
from in an energy terms, yes.
Yes, in energy terms. Was there ever any discussion about when that dial would switch to the other way around, where it be more efficient in that sense than soil washing in any circumstance, or is it just it's a more effective method of removing for certain issues?
I think for the nature of the soils that we had, because through doing their testing, DEME were able to demonstrate that it was predominantly the granular fraction that was impacted. That was the majority of materials. So soil washing made sense in that effect. I also think what hadn't been taken into account when thermal was chosen, how you'd actually go to put the treated materials back down, because they'd needed some degree of treatment in order to reuse. As I said, I think the client was very relieved that they did switch to soil washing given the price hikes in gas.
Yeah. No, it's always good to see going down sustainable routes, regardless of.
I think that the shame, being completely open, that the shame was that the filter cake that ended up going to Middlesbrough. We were in negotiations with a contractor in Glasgow, but that never came to fruition. But it did allow a lot of soils to remain on site. Yeah,
I don't know about the other people in the audience, but it's often something we see is actually quite a lot of material ends up going down with England, and it seems like it's such a sustainability nightmare.
Yeah. Well, they actually drove past the facility that we were trying to negotiate with.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely a topic that needs, I think, as an industry, we need to look at in some way. But obviously, we're trying to reduce how much material goes off-site. But
yeah.
And I had a wee question, if Heloisa, if you're still there, if there was ever any discussion or looking into the best method of field testing. Of how it would be implemented. Would it be mixing of soils or would it be injection or some other method, or yeah?
Mhm.
'Cause-
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yep.
Just a second. Let me just put the camera back. Yeah. We are actually, I just received an email. The tests that we executed were test tubes and mesocosmic experiments and soil cylinders. We are starting to think about field trials for summer 2025.
Oh.
Ideally, I want to try 3 different methods, like simple percolation, that would be simply pouring the solution. I think we need to try that for topsoil for 30 centimeters. And then some form of injection, or in maybe another one as well.
Yeah.
Mechanical
Okay.
turbation, and then another type of application. We haven't decided yet, but I
Yeah.
want to try. We want to try 3 different ones. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that'll be really interesting to hear about when you've done that.
Yeah. Next year.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And just a final chance, has anyone got in the audience got any questions for our 2 wonderful guests today? I think that's a sign of it's too comprehensive, your talks. But again, I'd like to thank you both for coming and presenting today. They're both really interesting presentations. Sorry, chat makes it sound a bit too informal. But thank you so much, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and also putting their input into the polls and listening through the AGM. And we'll be back in the new year, where we'll be looking at sorting out the webinars, as we say, for the early careers, / back to basics, as well as looking at the next year's conference as well. So stay tuned for more information. And again, thank you so much for everyone joining in today. And I hope you all have a wonderful winter break and a new year. Yep, and the only thing I've got is a couple of messages just from people saying thank you very much, and both talks were very interesting, so positive feedback. But yes, thank you everyone, and yeah, that's